Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing something a little bit different. Now, I came up with the idea for a video like this when I was doing my ranking of the best Sharks teams of that past decade. When I was deciding between the 15-16 season and the 18-19 season, I was thinking about how there were probably some people who could vouch for one year, some people who could vouch for the other year, and it got me thinking of what other sort of decisions related to the San Jose Sharks could there also be sort of a 50-50 split or maybe a bit more than that. And it actually got me thinking about the two Sharks goaltenders of that decade, being Antti Niemi and Martin Jones. Now, not entirely the decade, of course. For my Sharks teams of the decade video, I had from 09-10 to 18-19, and of course in 09-10 the Sharks had Evgeny Nabokov as the starting goaltender. So I will be discussing who was the best Sharks starting goaltender from the 10-11 season up until this current season, the 19-20 season. I feel like that's fair because Niemi got 5 seasons, including one that ended up being lockout shortened, and of course Martin Jones also with 5 seasons, including this one, which was shortened by the coronavirus that has cut off the last few games. So while slightly longer in terms than the 48 game season that the Sharks had in 12-13 with Niemi, I still thought it was a fair comparison. And as you can see, when it comes to the regular season stats of Niemi and Jones, they almost started the exact same amount of games, 296 for Niemi to 292 for Martin Jones. So a pretty fair comparison there. Niemi edged out Martin Jones in terms of win with a 163 compared to Jones's 155. And the stats for goaltenders are heavily in favor of Antti Niemi, where he is rocking a 2.39 GAA to Martin Jones's 2.63 GAA, as well as .917 save percentage, which is above average and near close to a top 10 goaltender in the league, compared to Martin Jones's .907, which is a lot more in line with about the average and potentially even slightly below average. So when it comes to the regular seasons, it seems as though Niemi does have the advantage there. But moving into the playoffs, that's where Martin Jones really gets his big advantage. Niemi with 40 games started over 4 playoffs. Of course, in 14-15, the Sharks missed, as with Martin Jones, who the Sharks were going to miss the playoffs this year. 19 wins for Niemi with a 2.82 GAA and a .906 save percentage. When it comes to Jones, 60 games started, so 50% more games started. And again, that's in 4 seasons like Niemi's was, with 32 wins, a 2.3 GAA, and a .921 save percentage. So Jones' stats significantly better when it comes to the playoffs. Now, I know there are a lot of people who probably don't remember Niemi all too fondly, honestly enough, as probably one of the biggest memories of Antti Niemi with the Sharks was that 2014 series against the Los Angeles Kings. The Sharks ended up getting reverse swept. Antti Niemi was not good in that series. In fact, he didn't even actually start Game 6 of that series. Todd McClellan thought it was correct to bench Niemi for that one and play the backup goaltender Alex Stalock at the time. And while that, that was probably the closest of the 4 games that the Sharks ended up losing in that reverse sweep. So that's certainly a bad memory that people have of Niemi, but realistically, he was actually quite good for the Sharks, especially in the regular season. He is the only of these 2 goaltenders who actually got nominated for the Vezina in the lockout shortened season. Niemi rocked a .924 save percentage, very, very good. Ended up coming, I believe, 3rd in voting in that regard. Martin Jones, I don't think has ever been closer to maybe 7th or 6th in terms of the Vezina. That was in the first couple of years with the Sharks. But Niemi was good, very good in the regular season. Now, in the playoffs, it didn't necessarily always carry through. The 10-11 playoffs weren't great for him. Of course, the 13-14 playoffs weren't all that great. But the 11-12 playoffs, it's hard to put too much blame on Niemi. He was decent, but just the team wasn't really good enough. And in the 12-13 playoffs, well, Niemi was very good. It just, unfortunately, they ended up losing in that 7-game series against the Kings. When it comes to Martin Jones, he was quite good for the Sharks in the first 3 regular seasons, for the 15-16, 16-17, and 17-18. But it's been as of late where Martin Jones has heavily dropped off. In, of course, the 18-19 season, the Sharks had a very, very good team up front. They were 2nd in the league in terms of goal scoring, only behind the historic Tampa Bay Lightning, and yet Martin Jones was really the weakest link in the regular season there, and while he did end up bringing it back somewhat in the playoffs, it really wasn't all that great, and it was hopeful that Jones could turn it around coming into this current regular season, the 19-20 year, and yet he was still quite bad, and while in the last couple of weeks he showed some improvements, all in all, the stats were not there to back him up. So Niemi remained consistent for the majority of his regular seasons with the Sharks, actually for all of them, even in the year the Sharks missed the playoffs, while Martin Jones has fallen off in the past couple of years. However, when it came to Jones, he always managed to step it up in the playoffs. Those first 3 regular seasons were good, but the playoffs of those years were even better, and after a pretty disastrous 18-19 season for him, while it was inconsistent at times, the first few games of the Vegas series were obviously not great, were actually very bad, I should say, and the series against the St. Louis Blues wasn't that great either. The ending few games of the Golden Knights series were very good for Jones, and the series against the Avalanche was mostly also quite good. So Jones always known to really step it up, and that's something Niemi never really did for the Sharks. Now, a couple of other things to consider. While I won't necessarily go by team strength, obviously I could say maybe the 18-19 season for the Sharks, if they were somehow worse up front, maybe it could have gone even worse for Martin Jones, and so maybe his stats were even just remotely below average because the team in front of him was so good. Who knows if you could go something like that. I won't go too deep into that. But what I will consider something very important when it comes to the differences between the regular seasons of Niemi and Jones is that these two goaltenders played in vastly different styles of seasons. While there were only a few years of difference between them, a lot really changed in the NHL over those few years. So let's just take the final regular season that Niemi was with the Sharks, the 14-15 season. The Art Ross winner that year was Jamie Benn with a grand total of 87 points, which was extremely low for an Art Ross winner. You take a look at last year, the 18-19 season, the Art Ross winner was Nikita Kucherov with over 40 points more than what Jamie Benn had, 128 points. There were multiple players with 100 points last season. Jamie Benn's 87 points would not have been able to even crack the top 15 of point scorers last season. So there was a big difference in terms of offensive capability from the 2014-15 season to the 2018-19 season. A lot has changed in terms of rules with icings and the likes, as well as with goaltending regulations of what size pads and blockers and gloves that they can use. So a lot really did change over those first few years, and while this doesn't fully justify the difference between the stats of Martin Jones and Antti Niemi in the regular season, it does help to justify why they might be so large. Jones obviously playing in a much higher scoring era compared to when Antti Niemi was, even if it was just a few years difference. And so, with that said, that is why I do believe Martin Jones was the better goaltender for the Sharks this past decade than Antti Niemi. Maybe there's a bit of recency bias in that, but I think a lot of credit does have to go to Martin Jones, not only for being able to get the Sharks to the Stanley Cup Finals, which was something Niemi was not able to do during his time, but for how much Jones was able to step up in the playoffs. I pointed out how Niemi was good in the 12-13 season, very good in the 12-13 playoffs, and was pretty good in the 11-12 playoffs, but the 13-14 and the 10-11 did leave a bit to be desired. The 10-11 especially, the Sharks made it to the conference finals, and it was sort of not really Niemi who managed to do that for them. And yet when you look at Martin Jones, the 15-16 playoffs, while maybe Jones wasn't the all-around MVP, that would maybe go to Logan Couture, Jones was absolutely the MVP in that final series against the Penguins, and that went to 6 games, which obviously should not have even gone to 6 games had Jones not been so spectacular in that series. And in the 16-17 series, I feel like Jones was one of the few Sharks players who actually showed up in that first round series against the Oilers. And then the 17-18, while he wasn't fantastic against the Golden Knights, he just blew the Anaheim Ducks out of the water in that first round sweep, letting in, I believe, just 4 goals during those 4 games. So Martin Jones has always managed to augment his level, to bring up his level of play moving into the playoffs. He's definitely a clutch goaltender in that regard. He probably boasts one of the best Sharks goaltending performance in the playoffs of that decade, just with that performance in Game 6 against the Golden Knights in the 18-19 playoffs. And so with all that said, even though there is a pretty notable difference in regular season performances between these two goaltenders, with it being sort of era adjusted in that way, and with the fact that Jones is significantly more impactful in the playoffs than Antti Niemi was, I do believe that Martin Jones was the better starting goaltender of the decade for the Sharks. Class dismissed.